Our next speaker is Brenda Barrett. Brenda Barrett has a long career in the Pennsylvania State Heritage System, heritage museums and natural areas, but she's especially well known for setting up the national heritage areas, the big landscapes in the US park system. And she's been a long advocate for that, so we look forward to hearing from Brenda. Please welcome her.
I just want to thank everyone who's made this conference possible today, and to allow me to make some new friends, and Archer and Jane, it's just been really terrific working with you. Now, as we've heard over the last day and a half, the idea of cultural landscape is important, it's expanding, there's huge enthusiasm for adopting this approach as it really opens the doors and increases our understanding of the complex interrelationship of man and the environment, past, present, future. It's very powerful stuff. But as we've also learned the hard way, it's not enough just to designate these special areas and to script out a plan for their management. We really need to take action to preserve landscapes, and the larger the resource, the larger the landscape, the higher the level of difficulty. So today, to use George's term, I'm really a tree today, and I'm here, the purpose of my presentation is to look at the emerging trends in the nature conservation movement in the United States in the area of large landscape conservation, and to see what kind of lessons that we here in the cultural landscape side of the fence might learn from that. What are our commonalities and challenges, and what can we recommend that we bring over into this work? Now, the importance of looking at culture and natural values in the cultural landscape program has been a recurrent refrain in both past World Heritage gatherings and, I might say, a refrain in this conference itself. A decade ago, at the Ferrara workshop, attendees envisioned strengthening the cooperation between natural and cultural heritage institutions and overcoming that dreaded administrative divide between the institutions, and looking again to this holistic management approach. At the Natchitoches Declaration, it starts out with the sort of stirring statement that there is a convergence of natural and cultural values in the landscape and a growing recognition that the traditional separation of nature and culture is a hindrance to protection and is no longer sustainable. And it goes on again to recognize that the multiple values, the multiple voices that are needed, and the need for strong community engagement. So as the purpose of this panel is to look from the ground up on the management of cultural landscapes, and the importance of bringing together culture and nature is so important and has been emphasized, I think, throughout our declarations, again, in the recent past, going back a decade, and even, again, at this conference itself. I thought it might be productive for us to take a visit to the other side and report on what's going on in nature conservation. And it's really a good time to do so because it's really a fertile field here in the United States, lots of new ideas. However, there are a few things we need to know before we make that trip. And the first thing is that, of course, they're using the word landscape a little differently. When the nature conservation people use the word landscape, they're talking about large landscape conservation that brings together public and private collaborations, looking beyond political boundaries and property lines to achieve natural resource goals, such as water quality, enhancing biodiversity, forest fragmentation, wildlife migration corridors, and other ecosystem benefits. However, many of these goals are very compatible with the work that we do and just add additional value to the same place. Now, the growth of the large nature conservation movement is pretty spectacular. In a recent report by the Regional Plan Association in New York, they identified 165 large landscape conservation initiatives just in the 13-state Northeast Megaregion. And there's a similar project inventorying these projects in the West, and it's equally staggering. And here's the real kicker. 80% of these projects have emerged in the last decade. So it's really new, and makes national heritage areas, of which there are now 49, and now more than 2 decades old, seem kind of older. But it also gives us some amazing data sets to take a look at. So what can we learn about managing landscapes from the natural resource side? And I also want to note that Barbara Paul gave us a great presentation earlier about how landscapes are used on public lands as a public land management tool. The Bureau of Land Management uses the National Conservation Landscape System. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also uses the Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And again, they're using landscape in a slightly different way, but they're all our partners. But I want to show you 2 quick examples, and I'm going to look at mixed landscapes, both public and private landscapes. The first is the Pennsylvania Wilds. It's, again, another superlative. It's the largest eastern United States landscape initiative with millions of acres of forested protected lands, 29 state parks, Allegheny National Forest, and it's about the size of Yellowstone National Park, but it also includes 12 counties with people who living there. The project was convened and led by the agency that I used to work for, the State Natural Resource Agency, and it was used as a pilot project to understand how landscapes, natural resources could be conserved in partnership with residents, tourism providers, and state heritage resources. The goals of the project were to develop a sense of identity, to develop a stewardship ethic for the landscape, and also, again, for economic value. I mean, this is the state of Pennsylvania, and an early effort was to brand the area with a new logo and give it some name recognition. One example that we can learn from the Pennsylvania Wilds was some evaluation work that they did. They did extensive evaluation to understand how to build partnerships and how the partnership process worked, because they were planning 6 more collaborative processes across the state. They also had to justify their $16 million investment. So what did they learn? Well, they learned that from an economic point of view, the project had some benefits, and everyone at the local level was happy about that. But the evaluation process also showed some interesting difficulties in developing a common approach with public land managers and residents, the difficulty of setting boundaries, the challenges of cultural and natural heritage values working together, and just the size of the project. On a positive note, it also showed that there was really, you could actually make collaborative management work if people put their mind to it. And then finally, this project showed a list of critical ingredients, very similar to the ones we saw in national heritage areas, that are crucial to these efforts: a sense of place, a sense of readiness, which could also be a sense of threat, pairing of strategic interests, and the role of public agencies, public lands. The next project I want to touch on is the crown of the continent. So let's go west to a transboundary region in the Rocky Mountains, 18 million acres, Alberta, and British Columbia, provinces in Canada, and the state of Montana. It's a very diverse, wild, and intact ecosystem, and it includes the World Heritage Site of Waterton Glacier International Peace Park and 3 biosphere reserves. It's also the home to ranchers, loggers, gateway communities who provide visitor services, and Native people who have lived there for thousands of years. Efforts to conserve the area have been many. There have been enormous numbers of coalitions of literally 100 agencies, non-governmental organizations, and community-based forums. The goals of the project have been, again, very broad too: conserving habitat, migratory routes, fostering economic prosperity, sustaining communities and cultural identities, developing energy resources, etc., and managing climate change. As you can see from this map, this is a really, dauntingly large area. But in 2007, co-convened by the University of Montana and, interestingly, by the Lincoln Land Institute in Cambridge, there was a pilot project to put together a sort of overarching group, a roundtable on the crown of the continent, to look at large landscape scale practice. And these are the groups that came under that roundtable. These are all the different groups that were already in the region, including, you can see, tourism providers, public land managers. And 4 subregions that were totally involved in preserving and buying land in the area. So given the short time frame here, I don't have time to delve deeply into these case studies. I just want to show you the scale of the opportunity out there. But there are some common themes. One is the importance of convening around place and having dedicated staff to do that convening. In the Pennsylvania Wilds, again, it was the State Natural Resource Agency. In the Crown of the Continent, it was actually the big nonprofit nature conservation organizations, private groups, who funded this pilot project and got it going. Again, engaging local communities and public land managers, sort of the next step in convening. And it's important to note that both projects, and many of these projects, really look at meeting local needs. You know, the sustainability of community opportunity is very, very important. And then finally, conserving the land and natural resources, often with a big push to land conservation. They also face very common challenges, which I really didn't get to go into in the case studies, but as you can imagine, setting boundaries, what's large enough to protect the resource, and I'm sure these sound familiar, working at scale, overcoming distances, funding the convening role on a permanent basis, and that is, in these difficult economic times, this is really a challenge. Pennsylvania is in economic distress, and the Pennsylvania Wilds, who's used to a generous budget, is really facing difficult times. Not yet an issue in the Crown of the Continent, but you have to look ahead. And finally, evaluating the outcome of the work in large landscapes. Small inputs, big landscapes. How do we know we're making a difference? Pennsylvania Wilds did some really good evaluation work, but will it ever be followed up on to understand what's next? Finally, I think there's great opportunity in working with large landscapes because they are committed to improving their practice. At a recent conference in New York City, they brought together 125 practitioners to build a network of comparable efforts and organizations. And here's an interesting learning from that conference. At the end of the conference, they took a poll and they asked the attendees, what is the most important factor to improving landscape practice and policy in the northeastern United States? 94% of the participants voted that most important was, quote, to create a narrative of the region that motivates the people who live there. In other words, the significance of the story that was paramount to natural resource conservation. And this, I think, again, is a great opportunity for us to work together on the ground. I also just want to mention two projects that are very exciting. One is the Gullah Geechee project, who needs help in preserving their land. And then project that we've heard about earlier today on the compact work that has been done internationally, I think that has, again, global significance. Finally, I'm going to skip to the recommendations, and I think the recommendations that we need to follow up on are, as a group together, both culture and nature, we need to strengthen the effectiveness of on-the-ground conservation. We need to target multiple values when we look at our projects. We need to bring together new resources and strategies, particularly the idea of acquisition and fee ownership of properties. We need to develop a more effective community of practice, and I think there's great opportunities for efficiency of scale. We need to respond to the threats on a landscape scale, and I love this term, the unexperienced pressures, for example, of energy scale extraction or extreme population changes, and we also, again, need to bring more political and policy heft to our holistic landscape scale work. In the end, I think this is very good news. I'm an optimist. I conclude that the forces are shifting us together and that we're running down one side of the bank of the river. They're running down the other side of the bank of the river, and we're soon going to just jump over. So thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And it was very interesting to see the shared issues, the common themes between those large areas. So I think there's some great food for later discussions. Thank you very much.